Let's talk to our students about sexually transmitted diseases. The basics. This can sometimes be a very difficult subject to talk about, understandably, but there's three very basic things that you need to communicate and have a conversation with your student about. First, these diseases are transmitted sexually. We get a lot of questions from students, even some parents, wondering about different ways to get these STDs or STIs. But know, and you want to communicate to your student that these are transmitted sexually. So if they are staying sexually abstinent, they'll be safe from these STDs. The second thing that you want to communicate to your student about STDs is that they show no partiality. They're not prejudiced against a certain race or gender. They don't prefer a certain region of the world or a certain socioeconomic status. They show no partiality. The third thing that you want to communicate about STDs is they can be transmitted with the 4 different types of sex. A lot of times our students are told lies that certain types of sex will keep them safe. It's not true, and you want to make sure they know that truth. The breakdown. Here are the 8 most common STDs. Now, we highly recommend that you check the CDC website for any up-to-date news and check it regularly, as things can very possibly change. Chlamydia. This is the most common STD that we know of. In fact, it may sound very familiar to you from when we were back in junior high and high school. It's been around for a really long time. One of the biggest things about chlamydia is it can be asymptomatic. So it's very important that if a student is being sexually active in any of the 4 different types of sex, they get tested. Gonorrhea. In the schools, we tell the students that chlamydia and gonorrhea are almost like twins. Sometimes they show symptoms, sometimes they don't. It's also important to know about gonorrhea that it can be transmitted through 3 of the 4 types of sex. Very important for your student to know. HPV. HPV stands for human papillomavirus. It's probably one that maybe your student is familiar with, as it's a very common one nowadays. In fact, there's a good chance that your student may know someone, may even have a friend who has contracted it. What is very important to know, especially if you have a male student, it is asymptomatic for guys. So a guy can be a carrier of HPV, very possibly transmit it to his female partner, and she would be infected and show symptoms. She may be confused with that, but the guys can carry it but don't show symptoms of it. There are different types of HPV. What's interesting is, obviously, we wouldn't know what kind of HPV we contracted. It would just simply be the kind that was transmitted to us. So that's something to communicate to your student. Also, very important, there are types of HPV that are linked to cervical cancer. That's probably something that you might be aware of. Maybe you've even been encouraged when you take your child to the pediatrician to get the cervical cancer vaccination. It's fine, it's up to you, your business, or whether you do it or not, but make sure you know it's not protecting them against contracting HPV. It's protecting them against the possibility of getting cervical cancer. If they have any type of sex with someone who has HPV, they will receive HPV, but that vaccination might protect them against the cervical cancer. More recently, there have been cases of throat cancer that have been linked to oral sex as a result of HPV. That's something you want to communicate to your student. Even though it's awkward and it's hard to have that conversation, they need to know that all the types of sex can transmit these STDs. Genital herpes. The big thing about genital herpes is there is no cure. The people that get genital herpes, that contract it, they are infected for life. And you may have seen commercials about support groups or even possible treatments that keep it from flaring up, and it's true, but there is no cure to genital herpes. Something important to make sure your child knows is herpes 1 is herpes of the face, herpes 2 is herpes of the genitals. So it's the same virus, it just shows up in different areas. Keep that in mind when you're communicating about different types of sex, because herpes of the face can turn into herpes of the genitals. You want to be careful and make sure that they understand the truth. Trichomonas. Now this is one you probably haven't heard of. It's actually a parasite, so it's one of these STDs that's different than bacterial or viral. We don't know a ton about it, but we do know that it can be cured, but only if there is treatment that is involved. Syphilis. This one's been around for a long time. Again, it might sound familiar to you from when you were in junior high and high school. This one I call the silent killer because there are 3 stages of syphilis. The first, if the person contracts syphilis, they get a rash on their hands. Now, if you're like me and you're working out in the yard or you know, in an area, that maybe you're not familiar with, you might get a rash every once in a while on your hands. So if this person's not paying attention and it goes untreated, the rash can go to their whole body. Now, I would hope at that point that the person would realize that something's not right, especially if they're being sexually active. But if this person ignores it, and it's been on their hands, it's on their whole body, it can attack their spinal cord. It can cause cases of blindness, it's caused cases of brain damage, paralysis, and even death. So this one's a serious one, obviously, in that it can be treated, but only if a person is paying attention. Here is where we tell our students, if they are going to make the adult decision to be sexually active in any of those 4 ways of having sex, they need to make the adult decision and see a doctor at least once a year. The doctor can perform the test, can run the STD testing, can even give the treatment, but it's important that they take that adult responsibility and take care of themselves. HIV and AIDS. Keep in mind when you're communicating to your student about HIV and AIDS that it has to do with our immune system. Explain that to them. With HIV, their immune system is compromised. With AIDS, their immune system is gone. So someone who has AIDS could very possibly die of a common cold because they don't have that immune system helping them out. People have lived their whole life with HIV, so that is something that you can communicate. But the big thing with HIV and AIDS is emphasizing the immune system. The last STD we'll talk about is pubic lice, or crabs. That's not necessarily a slang because it is kind of like a crab-like lice that attacks our genital area. It is a similar bug to the lice that we can get on our head and our hair, if that's important to explain to your student. But it acts the same, as in it's hard to get rid of. It is annoying. You're not going to die of pubic lice, but it can be something that can flare up and annoy and frustrate for the whole life if it's not taken care of. The bottom line, I know this has been a probably more difficult subject to breach. Let me say before we get to some of the other stuff, who you are, your story, your influence is still so important. Like we have said every video that we've had on here, don't neglect your influence. They want to hear you talk about these hard things just like they want to hear you talk about the easy things. So don't be afraid. Something important to emphasize, sexual abstinence is the only 100% way of staying free of STDs. 100%. In fact, this statistic might help. Half of all sexually active persons will contract an STD by the age of 25. Condoms and other types of birth control can't protect, especially in the case of skin-to-skin contact, which is one of the types of sex. Just a reminder, say the hard things. We know it's uncomfortable. We know it is difficult. We have to say it to students that we don't even know in a classroom. I can't imagine having to say it to my own child. But they need to hear the hard, just like they need to hear the easy, and they need to hear it from you. Text us with any questions that you have. We hope this video is helpful, but if there's any way that we can help, we would love to.